Hi, I'm Donna Jordan from Jordan Fabrics. Today, I'm going to show you how to make some fancy but easy borders that you can add to any quilt to make it a lot more fun. So I have a quilt top all done and it's ready to have borders put on it. So the first thing I'm going to show you how to do is just put a plain border around the quilt. Because whether you're doing a fancy patchwork border or a plain border, the method for measuring it and stitching it on is going to be exactly the same. So no matter what kind of border you're putting on your quilt, you'll know how to do it. The first thing I need to do is figure out how to cut my borders. So I always make a sketch of the quilt and then I put the borders on. It doesn't really matter if you want to put your side borders on first and then your top and bottom, or you want to do it the other way. It's going to take the same amount of borders either way. Now my quilt, I measured it. It's 39 by 58. So that means this border that I'm going to put on first is going to be 58 inches. And I think that on the quilt I'm doing right now, I will cut it 2 inches wide. That means after I stitch it on, subtract the seam allowances, it's going to be 1.5 inches finished. So it's going to be a nice narrow border. So that means that this border on the top and bottom, it's going to be 39 plus 1.5 on each end. So it's going to be 42 inches. So now I need 42 plus 58 plus 42 plus 58 to get all the way around the quilt. So let's add that up. 42 plus 58 plus 42 plus 58. So we're going to need 200 inches of border. I'm going to write that down here. Now my fabric is about 42, 43 inches wide, but some fabrics have a selvage printed, so I figure I can always get at least 40 inches. So I'm going to get this 200 and I'm going to divide it by 40 inches. Now I got exactly 5 pieces. That means if I cut 5 pieces of fabric like this, sew them all together, it'll be long enough. But 5 is kind of close, so I'm going to cut 6 pieces at 2 inches. Now, this fabric doesn't have a one-way design. If you had a stripe or a certain motif that had an up and a down, you might need to cut your borders the other way. But most fabrics you can successfully cut this way and stitch them into one long piece. So to figure out how much yardage you need for your border, look at how many strips you figured you need. I need 6 for my quilt. And the width you're going to cut them, I'm going to cut them 2 inches and just multiply. So I need 12 inches of running yardage. So I'm probably going to buy 3/8 or half a yard. If I needed to cut them 5 inches wide, 6 times 5 is 30, I'm probably going to buy a yard of fabric. Now we're going to take all of our cut border pieces right to the sewing machine, and I'm just going to sew them into one really long piece. Now I'm just going to iron this so that all the seams are laying flat, and it'll be real easy to get it onto the quilt. Now instead of measuring the border and cutting it to a certain size, it's much easier to take your border and lay it right on your quilt. So my quilt is laid out flat on the table here, and I'm going to line this up with the edge here. Not on the very edge of the quilt, somewhere in the middle. And I'm just going to smooth it down all the way down here. And then when I get to the end, I'm going to cut it off. And the easiest way to get a straight cut is to fold it back on itself so the fold is even with the edge of the quilt. put your scissors in there. You can put your blade right up against that fold and cut. Now I'm going to do the same thing another time, so I'll get 2 borders, one for each of the sides of the quilt. So the reason I like to do this somewhere near the middle or not along the edge is because if you have bias edges, if you have any patches that have bias edges on your quilt, when you're smoothing this out, you could, and you're on the edge, you could be stretching it. So let me show you what I mean. So say this is on the edge of your quilt. We've got straight grains here and here, and these don't really stretch very much. But this is a bias edge, and this will stretch a lot. So if you're smoothing your border out here, you could stretch this as you're smoothing it out. And then what will happen is as you go all the way around the quilt, your border will be bigger than the rest of your quilt. So when you lay it out in the middle, that can't happen. Now I'm just going to pin this along the edge here before I stitch it on. Now I'm just going to make sure everything is lined up and make sure my border is right along the edge of my patchwork and stitch it on with a careful 1/4 inch seam. Now I'm just going to finger press the seam here away from any of the patchwork. So I'm going to press it out to the side. And I always like, if I see any threads here as I'm going, I like to trim them off right now. Keeps the quilt a lot neater. Now I'm going to use the same method to do the borders this way. So I'm going to lay it out nice and flat. So I'm going to put this on the very edge, smooth it across, and trim it to size. So that's the method that you use to put any border on a quilt. So if you're going to put 2 or 3 borders on here, you're going to use exactly the same method. If you're going to put a patchwork border on here, you're going to use exactly the same method every time to measure and stitch it on. So the first fancy border I'm going to show you how to make is called the diamonds border. And that's what we've got on this quilt here. And it's made with strips of fabric. And I used jelly roll size strips. So these are 2.5 inch strips. And I've picked out some that will go with this quilt. So I added a few extra fabrics that aren't in the patchwork so that the border will be a little bit more colorful. Now we're going to take these strips and we're going to make a strip unit. Normally when I make a strip unit, I put the strips side by side, I line up the tops, and stitch all the way down the seam. But for this, I'm going to move it down 2 inches. 2 inches because that's how wide my strip is going to finish after I have seam allowances in it. It's cut 2.5, 2 inches finish size. Now the reason I'm going to move it down is because when we get it all done and we cut it, we will have almost 0 waste. And I like having 0 waste. I like being able to use up all of my extra pieces or all of the patchwork that I make. So just lay one strip on top of the other, use a 1/4 inch seam, and don't stretch either one, and stitch all the way down to the far end. Now I'm going to open this up and finger press the seam to one side. So I'm just pulling these open. And you can kind of feel with your fingertip if the seam allowance is going to the side there. And once you can feel it, just draw your fingernail or even just the tip of your finger right down that seam. And that'll make it lay nice and flat until we get the whole unit made, and then we can iron it. Now we're going to take the next strip. And it's going to go over here. But again, we're going to move it down 2 inches. So I've got this little measuring tape here. You can bring a ruler over if you need to. And we'll sew this strip on. Even though it's finger pressed, you do want to lay it on an ironing board, smooth it out, get it nice and flat, and then steam press it. Now I'm going to slide this over onto my cutting board. This cutting board and most cutting boards have a diagonal line on them. It's a 45-degree angle, and it's the most common line they will have drawn besides the grid lines here. So we're going to put the strip unit on one of these lines, and then I'm just going to slide it back so that I'm not wasting any fabric, and I can make a cut here. That's about as far as I can get. So I'm going to move this over here, and I'm going to cut right along this line. Now you can see why these are all moved down 2 inches, because if they were all coming to the end here, all of this would be waste. But when I cut it like this, we're not only losing just a little bit there. Now we are going to cut 2.5-inch strips. So I've got 2.5 inches. Can use my plastic ruler, line that up on my cut edge, and make a cut. Now you can see we've got the border right there. So I'm just going to keep making 2.5-inch cuts till I have cut up all of this strip unit. Now we're just going to sew these into one long piece. So sewing these together is a little bit tricky, because when you put them right sides together, you need to know, where do I put it? So we want to line up these raw edges, obviously. Now, if we line them up like this, we could stitch from here to here, but we're going to have about a 1-inch seam allowance. We want a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So we want a 1/4 inch from the raw edge to where those meet. It's a little bit easier if I show you on one where I drew a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I have a pencil line here. Now if we match up the edges, and that pencil line goes right to where that green is there, and right to where that green is there, we can just stitch on that pencil line, and you'll see what it looks like. And this just takes a little bit of practice. Every time I do this for the first time, I'm not as straight as I would like to be, and I sometimes have to take the seam out. But basically, if you open this up, you should and you iron it, you should have a nice line here and a nice line here with everything meeting up. Mine is not perfect yet, but it's pretty darn close. So just keep adding your pieces by putting the right sides together there, and then sliding it till it's a 1/4 inch away there, and then make your seam. See if this one's better. Yeah, that one's better. Just perfect. Now all we need to do is iron that one seam, that seam that we just did there, because the rest of these have already been ironed. Now you do want to be careful that you don't stretch it, because all the edges are bias. So just carefully lay it down, and you can iron the whole thing first if you want, like this. But at some point, you're going to want to trim off that little extra seam allowance there, which we call a dog ear. So I just like to take my scissors and just snip that off. Now let's see what this looks like up against the quilt. Ah, I like that. So I added more colors, other colors that weren't in the patchwork here. I added a little bit lighter this dark green. It's that color, but it's a little different. And I like adding extra colors there. Now to put this onto the quilt, we're going to use exactly the same method that we used earlier for these first borders. We're just going to lay it down very carefully, fold it and cut it. And I'm going to have to do the folding and cutting at both ends because that end is not straight yet. So I'm going to cut this one here. And I'm not going to worry about where the patchwork ends there. I'm just going to fold it and cut it off even. And then I'm going to move this over to the edge and pin it on. And again, you have to be careful because the border is all biased and it could stretch, but since we've cut it exactly to the length we need, we can lay it right down on here and pin it, and it will fit on there perfectly without stretching while we sew. The next border I'm going to show you is a quarter square triangle border. So I've got a couple little quilts that have this border on them. So this has quarter square triangles all the way around all four sides. Now this one here, it's got quarter square triangles, but it's only on two of the sides. So let me show you exactly how to make these. I'm going to make my quarter square triangles from 5-inch squares. These are charm squares. So I'm going to make two stacks here. I'm going to put half in one stack and half in the other. And I'm just going to put the greener ones over here and the lavender ones over there. So I've got half here and half here. Now to make quarter square triangles, we're going to start by making half square triangles. So the method I like best for making half square triangles is you take one of the squares, you draw a diagonal line. I'm just going to use a pencil right across the middle there, and we're going to put that on top of a different color square and take it over to the sewing machine. Now we're just going to stitch a 1/4 inch away from that drawn line on both sides. So I'm going to go down the one side, and my presser foot happens to be a 1/4 inch wide, so I can just put my presser foot right on that line. It's very convenient. Then I'll just spin it around and go down the other side. Now we're simply going to cut right along the drawn line. And then take these to the ironing board. Now I like to peel the top layer open so that I can make sure that the seam here stays straight and I'm not pushing it and distorting it. And I kind of press it down with my hands. Then I'm going to grab the iron and give it a little steam. And then the last step, we want to trim off those little dog ears. So the dog ear is that little extra bit of seam allowance. And I just like to trim that off even with the raw edge. It makes the block nice and neat, and it reduces bulk when we sew this block to other blocks. Once you've got your half square triangles done, grab two different ones, and we're going to put them right sides together like this. And I've got this seam allowance going that way, and on the back one I've got it going the opposite way. So it's real easy to get them lined up perfectly. But before we sew them, we need to draw a line. So we're going to draw a line on the back that's going in the opposite direction to that seam we've got in it. Then we're going to head back to the machine. So I'm going to line them up again here and use exactly the same procedure we did last time. We're going to stitch down the one side and back up the other, a 1/4 inch away from that drawn line. Now we're going to cut one more time along that line. Now, when we open this up, look what we've got. We've got 4 different prints all in one block. And it doesn't really matter which fabrics you use, just try to get 4 different ones each time you pick up a pair and match it up so that your blocks are nice and interesting. You do want to trim off those 2 dog ears here as well. And I'm going to go ahead and stitch up the rest of the blocks into quarter square triangles. Once you've got all these blocks done, head back over to the sewing machine. So you can lay it out ahead of time if you want to see what color is going to go next to what. I'm just going to turn these around as I go and make sure that I don't put 2 of the same colors right next to each other. So I don't want to do that. I'm just going to spin it, see what looks good. So let's take these first 2. They're exactly the same size. Now the seam allowances may nest like I've got here. That makes it easy to sew together, but sometimes, depending on how you have it turned, for instance, if I did it like this, all the seam allowances are going in the same direction, and that's okay. You can still sew it together. It just doesn't lay quite as flat as when they're nesting. Now I'm just going to finger press all of these seams in the same direction. So pull it open a little bit, draw your finger down there, same thing here, and just keep adding squares till you get it all in one big long piece. So I actually didn't sew all of the blocks into one long piece because I thought I might not want to make this extra long and cut it off in the middle of a block. I think I'd like whole blocks to show. So this is just slightly shorter than my whole quilt. And so all I'm going to do to make this fit is take some extra fabric. I've got a couple extra 5-inch squares, and I'm going to stitch one onto each end. So I'm going to stitch this onto here, and then I'm going to trim it so it's the same width. Stitch one onto the far end of the border. And then I'll have a border that's slightly longer than my quilt, and I'm going to fold it in half and find the middle of it and put that right here in the middle of the quilt and stitch in both directions, and then simply trim off the extra. And what we'll end up with is just a little bit of extra fabric on the end there. Now, if you do want your pieced border to fit exactly on your quilt, it is possible, but you have to do a little bit of advanced planning. So this quilt here, my pieced border, it fits just exactly onto my middle section here. And the way I did that was I adjusted how big this border was so that when I put these on, it would be the right length. So on our purple green quilt, I could have made my first border a little wider or a little narrower so that I could exactly fit that pieced border on there. Now for our third fancy border, we're going to do the one that's showing here, these on point squares. Now the easiest way to make this is with some jelly roll strips or even half jelly roll strips, and then cut some yardage into 3.5-inch strips. And I can see here I'm going to have to iron this up before I cut it. Now it's always a good idea to iron your fabrics before you cut them. This one happens to be particularly badly wrinkled, but even if it's not, your cuts will be more accurate if you get everything ironed nice and flat. Now, since I'm using half jelly roll pieces, I am also going to split these strips. If you're using whole jelly roll pieces, you would want to leave these whole also. Now take one of your jelly roll strips, and we're going to put these wider strips onto both sides of that. So I'm just going to put them right sides together and stitch down using a 1/4-inch seam. put strip onto this side. So I'm just gonna spin it around. Now I'm going to finger press all of the seams toward the purple. Now we're going to want to iron these up. Even though we finger press them, they're not completely flat. Now we're going to subcut this. So I'm going to line it up on one of the lines on my cutting board, and I'm going to cut it into 2.5-inch strips. Now to stitch these into a border, we're just going to move this down so that that intersection meets. So I'm going to put it right sides together, and you can even feel if they're meeting because this seam allowance is going down and that one's going up. So this is just loose here, so you can start the very top of that first strip. Now we're on both pieces, and just stitch all the way down. Now I'm going to finger press right now. I'm going to finger press this to the right. You don't have to press this part all the way down. It doesn't matter if that goes part way each way. It doesn't matter. Just press at least to the end of here. Now the next piece, again, slide it down, match that up, and stitch it on. These stitch surprisingly quickly. I made 4 border pieces here, 2 shorter ones and 2 longer ones. And of course your sizes may be different than the sizes I made. They'll depend on on the size quilt you have. So this is being finger pressed, but I'm still going to smooth it out here and then iron it. And you don't need to worry about the seam allowances here if they open up a little bit. I'll show you on the back side here. They don't have to stay 1/4 inch all the way down. It doesn't matter if they go to 0. You just want it ironed to one side where it's stitched. Now we're going to put this on our cutting mat. And I'm going to take the 2-inch line, let's flip it over right there, the 2-inch line on my ruler, and I'm going to put that line on these intersections. So I'm going to line it up here. And then I'm going to trim off all this extra stuff on this side here. Slide it up a little, get all that off. Now we're going to flip this around and we're going to do the same thing on the other side. So again, put the 2-inch line on those intersections. And what we're going to end up with is a nice 4-inch wide border. And we've got exactly the same amount on each side of all of these patchwork pieces. There, that looks really good on there. And you certainly could make this border as long as the quilt and simply cut off the excess. I would like to center this on the side here. And instead of just cutting this off somewhere in here, I'm going to neaten it up a little by putting some of this background on each end. So I've just got an extra 3.5-inch wide piece, and it's as long as these strip sets were. And I'm going to just stitch this onto here. So I'm just going to make sure it's at least 1/4 inch beyond that corner there and stitch it on with a 1/4 inch seam. And I know it feels awkward because it's not the right shape and it doesn't seem like it will fit on there. But all I'm going to do is iron this, cut it this way and cut it this way. I've got that extra piece stitched on both ends of the border here. So now I'm just going to continue the straight line I've got there, trim off the excess here. And the same thing over here. Trim that off even. And now I'm going to line this up on the cutting board line. And I'm just going to make sure I have it straight here. And cut that off. Now that looks good. Now I just want to see how much more I'm going to need on each end. So if I fold this in half, and here's the middle of my quilt, I'm going to need about 12 inches added here. I'm going to cut it a couple inches bigger. Always cut it a few inches bigger. So I'm going to stitch that on. It's going to be 4 inches wide, which is how wide this is, on each end, and then I'll bring it right back. Okay, so I'm going to find the center of the patchwork again. That's right here. And I'm going to lay this on top of the quilt. Again, not on the very end, somewhere up a little bit. And then I'm just going to trim off the extra from each end here. And then I can pin it onto the end and stitch it on. And remember, these edges on your border are biased, so you have to be real careful you don't stretch them as you sew them on. But if you pin it carefully, it won't stretch at all. So I've got borders onto all 4 sides of this, and I'm really happy with how it turned out. Now, you could put another border all the way around if you like. I think I'm just going to put some purple binding, and that will make a nice frame here. Now, my patchwork, it's centered here, but let's say you only have a little bit of extra scrap from your quilt, and you want to just do a couple of these squares. You could just put 3 squares here and 3 squares here, and the same thing on the far corner, so you don't have to do it all the way around like I've got it here. The other borders we made, here's these guys. Can't really tell what it looks like when you put it on the patchwork. We can kind of see it there. That one was really fun. This one, again, really fun, and this one might be a good one to put another border all the way around it so that you're kind of sandwiching the patchwork between solider pieces, because that highlights the patchwork. So I hope this gives you some fun ideas about adding some extra fancy borders to your patchwork, because you know, once you have the middle of your quilt done, it's nice to put something a little bit different on the borders. It really makes it unique and special, and it really can kick up the look of your quilt quite a bit, and it's a lot of fun. Thanks for watching our tutorial today on how to make fancy borders. We hope you enjoyed it. Now, if you have questions, you can leave them in the comments below and I'll be sure to answer them. Now, we always do a giveaway at the end of each video. So today, we're going to give away 2 items. This is a table runner, and it's made from a pattern called Tree Lot. It's made with jelly roll strips, and it's nice and long. You could use it as a wall hanging or as a table runner. And then we're also going to give away this fun wall hanging that I showed you earlier in the video with the patchwork border. So it's very easy to enter the giveaway. Just click the link below that says giveaway, and you enter your email and your name, and you could win one of these quilts. Now, if you like our videos and you want to support us, the best thing you can do is subscribe to our YouTube channel. That would really help us out. Happy quilting!